I got polio, and within a few days, I was completely paralyzed. My husband had an affair. Our son basically died of a heart problem. I was diagnosed with post-polio syndrome. My ex-husband came home and said he was leaving for someone else.
What in the world? Like, how many things can you go through?
Those years were the hardest years of my life, and they were the best years. Because
The best?
The very best.
So give us a little bit about, you came in here in a wheelchair.
Yes.
How does this happen?
I got polio as an infant. I was in India, 3 months old, and the vaccine had been developed, but in India, they often didn't give it at 3 months. And so I got polio, but the doctors had no idea what it was. So they gave me cortisone to lower my fever. They thought I had typhoid. And within a few days, I was completely paralyzed. And then they realized, wow, she didn't have typhoid. She had polio. But at that point, there was nothing they could do. I could not move my arms or legs. Complete quadriplegic. So they told my parents, just leave India. There's nothing we can do here. And in India, disability is a curse. And so there are, at the time, and maybe still today, very few services. I mean, people are pretty ashamed of having disability because it means you did something wrong. Your parents did something wrong. Somebody did something wrong. And so we moved from England. We moved from India to England and then to Canada and started having surgeries in Canada. So I had 21 operations by the time I was 13. I lived in the hospital for one time a year on my back in a body cast. I was 7 years old. So I remember 7 is a time of a lot of trauma. Like you start to have, for me, continuous memories of what that was like. I was pretty angry at God. My parents were Christians, and they would often say, God is with you. And I was like, God is not with me. I am alone in this hospital room. I didn't want to hear anything about God. And that was for years because it felt like people had really cliche answers to really hard questions. Trust God, it's all going to work out. Like, look at the bright side. Just things that made no sense to me.
And you still, at that point, couldn't move?
The weird thing about polio is after I got polio and I was a quadriplegic, probably within a few weeks or months, some of those muscles seemed to regenerate. So I wasn't able to walk, but I could move my legs. My arms are actually pretty weak and are still weaker. Still very, very weak. But when I was 7 years old, after multiple surgeries, then I was able to walk. So that was pretty incredible. And, a lot of miracles went through with that.
But you had been through a lot, physically and emotionally.
Yes. Yes.
Well, if I'm in a cast for a week, seriously, there's part of me is like, okay, how long is this going to take? You were literally for a year?
Yeah. Yeah, it was 9 months flat on my back in a body cast. And my parents could only visit me on weekends.
Oh.
We were in a Shriners Hospital, free hospital. There's a lot of people there whose families had sort of abandoned them. So the rule was parents on weekends only. And so that's all, my fear was these kids in the hospital, and a lot of them were terminal. My best friend died of cancer. He was in the ward with me, and they didn't tell you anything in the hospital. So I had all these questions, and one day they cleaned off her bed, and I didn't know what happened to her, and they just wouldn't tell us. So it was just this really interesting meaning really hard existence. And so from that perspective, people would come in and visit me and talk to me about God. I was like, my life is these four walls and these people. And I just couldn't believe that a loving God would have let that happen to me.
You're not alone. That's the question.
Yeah.
How did you resolve that?
Well, it was interesting when all the way through grade school, junior high, I went to church with my family because they were believers and I just showed up there.
And were you picked on at school?
Yes. So in elementary school, when I was 7 and just learned to walk,
You learned to walk at 7.
Yes.
Yeah.
And had gotten kindergarten, first grade, I guess around then, these kids threw stones at me as I was walking and pushed me down and called me a cripple. And I remember thinking, okay, I lived in the hospital. I could not wait to get out to be with normal kids was kind of the word I always used is I was not living a normal life. And I still remember that. Like I crawled over to a rock to get up and I thought, this world is not fair. Like, it was just so gut-wrenching to me. And I did not tell my parents. Like, I I didn't tell anybody for 20 years, probably.
20 years.
Because there felt like felt like shame, like I am that different and people don't like me that much. That
I'm so broken.
Yeah. Because I walked with a pretty severe limp and still do. And just like I'm ugly, I'm broken, I'm never going to fit in was sort of what I felt. I had a Bible from being confirmed at church, which is a little scary because I did not know Jesus, never picked up the Bible. So I ripped the cellophane off of it and opened it. And I said, okay, God, like, show me. Like, are you real? And I remember flipping first to Leviticus and going,
That's a good place to start.
Yeah, it's a great place. And I thought, I'm not sure. This is kind of what I thought about faith. And then I asked the question, I said, why did this happen? Why did this happen to me? If you're so good and you're so loving, what did I do for this to happen? And I flipped open the Bible randomly, but with God, nothing is random, to John 9, where Jesus is talking to his disciples and they see a man blind from birth and they say to Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents?
You turned right to John 9.
Yes. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? That was my question. Why did this happen?
Yeah.
Was this my parents? Was this me? Why are you doing this?
Because you were told as a child, like, oh, it must be your parents. It's a curse.
Right. So I was riveted at this point. And then Jesus says, it is not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the work of God would be displayed in his life. And that blew me away because my question was, why? What had I done? And Jesus and that's what the disciples were asking. And in a lot of ways, that's our question to everybody. Like somebody says, I got divorced. You're thinking, what did you do? Like we ask that question of ourselves and of other people. Like, what did you do wrong? And yet Jesus's answer had nothing to do with who sinned or whose fault it was or the why that they were asking, but why, what was the purpose? And it was for the glory of God. And that blew me away. I still remember thinking, wow, God is real and God is listening. God has heard. God knows me. And I knelt down by the side of my bed and committed my life to Jesus. I didn't know him, but I knew he knew me.
Wow. That is powerful, isn't it?
I'm tearing up.
Me too. It's just like, whoo.
I can see you on your knees. It's interesting that there's not, your friend went to the retreat and inspired you to even ask that question, but it's just you and the Word of God.
Yeah.
And to come to the realization you don't know God, but he knows you.
Yes.
He's seen you.
Right.
Whew.
Yeah.
And did it give you hope for your future?
Yes. Yes, it really did. I thought, okay, God is in my future. He's in my today. But interestingly, what I took from that was I've had my one piece of suffering. Like God is going to be glorified through my life.
My one thing.
And I remember, I literally remember thinking, you guys don't know, you're going to have suffering one day. I've had mine. It's in the rearview mirror. I'm good to go.
Let's move on.
And really functionally had a little bit of a prosperity gospel theology after that. Like if you do the right stuff, God is going to come through. And for 10 years, I had success, grad school, married a classmate from there. Just thought, you're faithful to God. You read the Bible. You love him. And life is going to be good. And
sounds like there's a but coming.
Yeah. Then, I turned 30 years old and life fell apart. And that was, I knew back to when I was 16, like, wow, there is a purpose, but it surprises you. I think we all get surprised by suffering. We sort of, when we have some success in life, we just think, okay, we need to just, be with God and he's going to bless us. But our definition of bless and God's definition of blessing are very different.
So what happened at 30?
30, I got married. I was married. My husband had an affair. So that sort of rocked my world and didn't expect it at all. But we put our marriage back together and marriage counseling, was very thankful for that. But then just as we had pretty much been through counseling for 2 years, got pregnant, and our son basically died of a heart problem. And the hard part about that, which I don't know how much time we have to go into the details, but he had heart surgery at birth, and he was doing great. And we went into a substitute doctor, And he thought Paul was doing so well. I don't think he really read the condition that he had, and he took him off his medicine and just said, oh, he's doing so well. I mean, he was like just thriving. And so he said, I think people over-medicate these babies, and he took him off his medicine, and 3 days later, Paul died.
Oh, Vaneetha, I remember when we talked about this before, but I remember feeling the weight of when you were born, when you had polio, when you were little, you were given the wrong medication.
Yes.
And now you have a baby son who seems to be like, okay, he's going to be okay. And then he passes away.
Yeah. And that was, I would say, my adult crisis of faith, because my marriage stuff, we worked on it together, but this felt like I had begged God. I mean, I still remember when Dave went with Paul in the ambulance, I got on my knees and I begged God. I mean, I said, I'll do anything. I will work in a soup kitchen. I'll teach Bible study the rest of my life. I was teaching Bible study at the time. Please don't let him die. Please don't let him die. And there was this sort of guilt feeling like, should I have seen the signs? Should I have, you do the what ifs. But I remember just bargaining, begging, and just really thinking, okay, God is hearing me. We're going to go to the hospital and it's going to be okay. And so going to the hospital and having them say, I remember saying, can I see him? I want to see him right now. And she said, I'm sorry, your son is dead. And I just could not process those words. They were just kind of ricocheting in my head. And they took me back to the room where he was. And it just didn't make sense to me that I had been faithful. I'd already been through suffering. It just felt like, God, where are you? And I had been teaching women's Bible study at the time. And so I felt like I needed to be strong for everybody else. And I would just say for anybody who's listening, you don't have to be strong. But I thought I needed to be because other people's faith rested on mine. So I started saying all the right stuff. I wrote thank you note after thank you note Paul had just had a baby shower on Saturday and he died on Sunday. So I'm sitting here writing thank you notes, which I'm kind of like, why was I doing that? But anyway.
Without processing your grief.
Right. And I was just like, God is good. God is carrying me. But with every thank you note, after a while, it was like, I don't know where God is. And I didn't have understanding of lament or drawing near to God. And so I just felt like you just got to buckle down. And my Bible was unopened and I felt so distant from God. And then
You're
one
mad
day,
at him.
Yes, I was very angry, but I didn't even know how to tell him that. Like I did not go to God. I turned from God. I wouldn't say I turned from God. I leaned away. I didn't want to look at God. I didn't want to talk to him. But then one day in the car, I just was so broken. And I just said, God, help me. And the presence of God filled my car. It is one of the most incredible moments of my life. Similar to when I came to Christ, God was there and he was like, I am with you. I am here. I was there with Paul. Like, this is not an accident. This is not a mistake. Trust me. And it felt unbelievable that was one of the purest moments in my life. But recognizing that God is with you is really incredible. It's better than not having pain. It's better than not having suffering.
You needed it.
Is meeting Jesus in your suffering. There's nothing like that.
And all you did was cry out.
Yes, that's all I did. And then I really discovered the language of lament, because it wasn't that took away everything. But I knew I can trust you, God, and I can go to you with how I'm feeling. And that transformed my relationship with God.
What do you mean, the lament part?
Yeah, I think
That you
the
could
lament,
be honest?
Being honest with him.
being honest, realizing I don't have to say things I don't feel. I can just go to God. And that was really important because 6 years after Paul died, I was diagnosed with post-polio syndrome. So we talked about the fact that I'm in a wheelchair. So I was walking. I used to walk to work, lived in Boston, lived on the 3rd floor. Like after all my surgeries, I lived a very normal life. But then 6 years after Paul died, diagnosed, and basically post-polio syndrome means your body is going backwards. So all the gains that I had made, they're getting undone. So I use a wheelchair more than I walk, although now I had a procedure done yesterday so I can walk, which is a huge blessing. but my arms are really weak, and, I can do so much less. I mean, Joel and I have been married almost 9 years next month. And I mean, my life is dramatically different than when we first met in terms of what I could do for myself. So I see it unwinding in that, but I knew God would be faithful. And so it was after that experience with Paul, I thought, okay, God, this is hard, but we are in this together.
But then you went through a divorce.
Yeah. So then 6 years after I was diagnosed with post-polio, my ex-husband came home and said he was leaving for someone else. And that wrecked me.
I mean, if you're listening, you're like me, like, what in the world? Like, how many things can you go through?
Yeah.
And yet, even after that, how did you lift your head back up to Jesus?
Yeah. Jesus was all I had. And I mean, I realized, like, I have no hope. Like, my kids were rebelling. Both of them walked away from faith. My body was weakening. There was nothing but God. And I would say those years were the hardest years of my life. And they were the best years. Because
the best?
The very best. Because I needed Jesus in a way I didn't need him. Like, I remember getting up extra early. I was homeschooling my kids for 2 years, which I really can't believe I did that because they were really angry at me, at God. But I would get up extra early and I'd open my Bible. And I just remember saying, my soul clings to the dust. Revive me according to your word. That's Psalm 119:25. And God did. Like, that was the most incredible time. Like, I can say Jesus was my joy. And every other part of my life was a mess. I mean, I could barely drive my kids. They were so angry with me. I mean, like, my daughter tried to run away in the middle of the night, screaming that she hated me. I ended up pouring a full glass of ice water on my other daughter because I was so angry at her. So it was like there was anger everywhere. And I didn't know how to regulate myself or them. I felt like a failure. And yet, God was so near. And I feel like that's the hope in suffering, even though our circumstances can be so hard. There is an intimacy with Jesus that I think is reserved for suffering.
Oh, that's a quote right there. Whew.